Hey everyone, welcome to the Optispan podcast. We're back with another round of Ask Matt Anything. This is where Nick goes on to YouTube and identifies questions that viewers have asked that he thinks might trip me up. So today we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff, it sounds like. I think we're going to talk a little bit about hormones, some supplements like Astaxanthin and C15, things like therapeutic plasma exchange, hyperbaric oxygen. So it's going to be kind of a mix of topics that people are interested in. So please keep those questions coming. And we've just recently put a form on the Optispan podcast website as well, where you can submit your questions and comments. So I would encourage you to do that.
The first one is, Matt, are you on testosterone therapy?
Yes, people want to know. I know this is a burning topic. So the answer is yes, I am. And, I think you know this, Nick. I've been wanting to put together an episode for the podcast on this topic to kind of share my experiences. And so now that we're talking about it, I will make sure to do that hopefully in the next couple of weeks. For now, I won't go into a lot of details. I'll just say that I think, like a lot of guys, I spent a few years procrastinating from the point where I knew and had been diagnosed as having low testosterone before I actually took the leap. I think part of the reason why I feel like it's important for me to share in detail my experiences is, again, I think a lot of guys go through this, and I was hesitant. I tried lifestyle. I tried, non-pharmaceutical approaches. Nothing worked for me. I learned a lot. I made a couple of mistakes along the way. So I'll talk all about that in detail. I will just say, I feel like this has been really one of the most valuable things I've done for my health. It's been about 9 months now. I have absolutely no regrets. I said I made a couple mistakes. I wish that I hadn't made those, although nothing, wasn't a huge deal. But overall, been super positive. So I'll be sure to put together a detailed episode on that, and hopefully people can get value from it.
You're going to talk about those mistakes and everything? And don't...
Absolutely, yeah.
Great.
And I will also say, I think, this isn't going to surprise people probably, but I've been a little bit hesitant to talk about it publicly, not because I think there's any reason why people who have hormone dysregulation shouldn't talk about it. Like you should fix it if it's something that needs to be fixed, both men and women, and it's what's right for you. But I think, even though I tend to be pretty resistant to, the comments that people make, look, there are just some assholes out there. And I know that simply saying that I'm on testosterone therapy, I'm going to get some asshole comments. It's fine. That's just the reality. But I think those types of comments, broadly speaking, are, again, why I think a lot of people are hesitant to talk about their experiences. So I'm just going to lay it all out there, and hopefully people find value in it.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. All right, so next one is, you put hormonal health as a number one position. What hormonal panel are you measuring, and how do you regulate it?
Yeah, so just to clarify, I wouldn't say it was a number one. I would say I put hormone health in that sort of top bucket, right? So if we think about, what are the levers you can pull that will have the biggest impact on overall health, I put hormones up there with lifestyle factors. And in fact, unless you have a specific chronic disease where you're taking medication for it, I would say ensuring that you have, optimal is a tricky word, but I'm just going to use optimal hormone health or normal hormonal status is probably the one pharmaceutical thing, assuming you go down the hormone replacement therapy path, that you can do that has the biggest impact outside of lifestyle, right? So the 4 pillars of health, we talk about lifestyle, eat, move, sleep, connect. I would kind of put hormone health in that same bucket. It's so important. And obviously that's partly based on my own experiences, which again, we'll have a dedicated episode to that. But I will say, for me personally, since I've gotten my hormone health back to where it should be, that also connects with the pillars of health. That has had a significant impact on the move pillar and the results that I see from my exercise regimen, the sleep pillar, and the connect pillar. And so I think, it just is really important. So that's why I emphasize it. So in terms of like, what do you measure? And I would say there's really 2 parts to this. One is, are we talking about somebody who is wondering if hormone therapy is right for them, or are we talking about somebody who is on hormone therapy? Because once you're on hormone therapy, the things you measure are going to be a little bit different than when you're trying to diagnose whether or not that's the right path for you to go down. So I'm going to talk specifically, I guess, today about, people who are not yet on hormone therapy. The one thing I will say is, even though I'll talk about the markers, I really, really, really recommend that you do this with a physician who has a lot of experience with hormone therapy, men or women. I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of docs out there now who will prescribe hormone therapy who don't have experience or don't do the sort of personalized stuff that I think is important to do it right. So leaving all that aside, if you're a do-it-yourself person, so I think for men, the essential markers you probably want to look at if you're trying to diagnose and understand are free and total testosterone. So not just total testosterone, but you need to know what your free testosterone is. FSH, so follicle stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone, and SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, are kind of the core set. And the reason why those are kind of the core set is because the FSH, if you are low in free testosterone or total testosterone, the FSH and LH will help you understand, is that primary or secondary hypogonadism? And SHBG is a protein that binds to testosterone and other sex hormones. And so high SHBG is often a cause of low free testosterone. For women, it's kind of the same set, but you're going to add in estradiol and progesterone. Having said that, really a comprehensive set is better. And so the only reason to look at the limited set is really cost. Comprehensive set is better. And those would include other things like prolactin, thyroid function for both men and women, insulin, IGF-1, DHEA, metabolic markers, because all of that goes into kind of understanding the overall hormonal status and within the sort of overall systems of health. So again, I said, you really should do this under the care of a doc who knows what they're doing when it comes to hormone health. If you're a do-it-yourself person, Ulta Labs has pretty good comprehensive hormone panels for both men and women. And they always are running a discount. You get 20, sometimes 30, 40% off. Their discount this month is health awareness, all caps. So I don't have any financial relationship to Ulta Labs. Maybe I should. I don't get any money from this. I'm just saying I've used them in the past, always gone really smoothly. They are a reseller of Quest blood tests. So any Quest patient service center, you can go get the blood draw and then it'll all work out through Ulta Labs. And I will say, from my experience, I've gotten a lot of blood draws in the last few years as I've started, really getting into this space. And at least here in the Seattle area, and I'll just give a shout out to the Issaquah Quest Service Center. They're fantastic. I've never had a bad experience with the Quest Service Center. So can't say the same thing about LabCorp. Sorry, LabCorp. You guys need to get your act together.
Yeah, all right. So quick, this idea for a spin-off episode. I think it'd be fun for you to sit down with Dr. Nikki Byrne or Dr. Kevin White and actually go through the characteristics of how to find a good doctor, what separates a good doctor from maybe a male type doctor.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great idea.
All right, next question. So, hi, Matt. I think I am fit and healthy and have good biomarkers, but I have high ApoB and LDL. Should I be worried?
So I don't know that I would say you should be worried. First of all, I mean, obviously there's a lot of anxiety that goes around with finding out your biomarkers are not optimal or other results that we sometimes get back from diagnostics that suggest, a potential minimally suboptimal health condition, potentially serious condition. So I get the anxiety. I don't think just because you have high lipids, that's immediately a reason to be fearful, but it's not optimal. And so I think it certainly is suggestive that work can and should and probably needs to be done to reduce your risk of, future serious health consequences. And of course, there are lifestyle approaches that can be taken if your lipids are dysregulated, and there are medications, pharmaceutical approaches. So definitely means that you should take a look and work on trying to get them into something closer to the optimal range. If you can afford it, I personally think that CCTA with Clearly can be useful in a situation like this, because what you'll get there is actually quantitative assessments of plaque burden, both hard and soft plaque, and where it's at. And so, we recently had an episode. I got a Clearly exam done a couple of months ago. We had an episode where Kevin White took me through my results. And so if you're interested, you can check that out. But I think that's nice because that tells you, independent of whether or not your biomarkers are suboptimal, what's your actual disease burden at this time. And then that can inform how aggressive you're going to be to try to bring the lipids down into an optimal range. So that's sort of my take. Like, don't freak out, but it's a warning sign to take steps to reduce or get closer to the optimal range. And it might suggest that you want to get a deeper diagnostic look. And again, CCTA with Clearly is probably the best way to do that right now.
Yep. All right. I resonate. This is my phenotype as well. I'm 33. I've been thinking about what steps you want to go next.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because, I think certainly the medicine 2.0 community would say that's too early to worry about, getting an exam to measure your plaque burden. I would suggest that, if you have familial history, you have chronic high levels, you've tried other things to bring them down, certainly you may want to consider medications at this point. But also, it might not be bad to get a deeper diagnostic quantitative evaluation of plaque burden. Now, you absolutely see plaque in some people at very young ages. So, I think that's something that you might want to consider, right? And obviously talk to your doctor about that.
I'm in the right spot for that. So
yeah.
All right, next question related. So Matt, have you checked your LP(a)?
Yeah, in fact, I check all my lipids pretty regularly. So I have both a family history and genetically predisposed to having high LP(a) and ApoB. And so, historically, both my LP(a) and ApoB have been borderline high, usually not outside the normal range, but sometimes. Most recently, my LP(a) was 65, so that's okay. Certainly better than it has been in the past. Fortunately, as we just discussed, I know that I currently have a very low plaque burden, although it is non-zero, so there is some early pre-disease or disease. So I need to, in my case, need to be what I would consider moderately aggressive at keeping my lipids in the normal to optimal range. And again, my diet is pretty clean. I exercise regularly. Like, I feel like from a lifestyle perspective, I am 90% doing the right stuff. And look, nobody's perfect. I'm not currently taking any lipid lowering medications, although I have certainly considered a PCSK9 inhibitor. Haven't decided to take that step yet, but that probably will be in my future at some point.
Why PCSK9 over statins? Because it's more of a clean drug.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with statins, and I'm certainly not an anti-statin person. Many of my best friends are on statins. I think so. Statins are effective at what they're designed to do, which is to lower cholesterol and lipids. The data on whether or not statins have a net positive effect on mortality is inconclusive, I would say. And again, it's hard to say because it's not like every study gives exactly the same answer, but it doesn't seem like there's an uptick in longevity or reduction in mortality from statins, which is interesting because if you are effectively reducing the risk of the leading cause of mortality, you would expect to see a reduction in overall mortality. The fact that that's not there may suggest that there are offsetting effects that we don't understand from statins that counteract the mortality benefits. So they're super effective at reducing risk of cardiovascular disease in people who are at high risk. So anyways, that's sort of where I stand on statins, is I'm not 100% sure that for somebody like me who, my lipids are okay, not great. So my risk is a little bit elevated because of lipids, but I don't have much plaque burden now, that's the right strategy to take.
Yeah, well said. I think with all the noise out there about statins, that was kind of refreshing to take. So
yeah.
I donate plasma regularly. Isn't that removing as much bad stuff as filtering and refusing it?
Right. So I think this question is related to therapeutic plasma exchange, which I've talked about recently, and I've I've posted a fair amount on Instagram and Twitter about my experience doing TPE in the last couple of weeks. And so the question is, wouldn't donating plasma be just as effective as therapeutic plasma exchange? And just to set, sort of some foundational information. So therapeutic plasma exchange is where you are actually hooked up to a device. Blood comes out of one arm, goes through the device. The red blood cells and white blood cells are spun out. The plasma is then collected, and then the red blood cells and white blood cells are put back in. And they also add saline and albumin. Albumin's a protein. And then it comes back into your other arm, right? And you circulate multiple total volumes of your body's blood over the course of 2 to 3 hours. So you're in a chair for 2 to 3 hours hooked up to this machine. Plasma donation is similar, except it's a much lower volume. Again, for therapeutic plasma exchange, it's about 3 to 4 liters. I think usually closer to 4 liters. Mine was. For plasma donation, it's more like 600 to 750 milliliters. So somewhere between 5 and 8-fold less volume. And they typically don't replace that volume with the saline and the albumin. So the biggest difference is it's just not as much of your total volume of plasma that is being replaced or removed, right? So yes, in theory, if you did plasma donation 5 to 8 times as often as you do therapeutic plasma exchange, you could equal that volume. But when you're not actually returning the volume like they do in therapeutic plasma exchange with saline and albumin, that might be hard to do, at least over a constrained time period. But yes, outside of that, in principle, the diluting out of the bad stuff should happen in both cases. It's just going to happen to a greater extent with therapeutic plasma exchange. The other thing that is sometimes done with therapeutic plasma exchange is something called IVIG, or intravenous immunoglobulin. And that is adding back immune support proteins to counteract inflammation and autoimmunity. And so in my case, there was a low dose IVIG that was done at the end of the therapeutic plasma exchange. That's never going to be done with plasma donation, because that's just not the purpose of plasma donation. So yes, I think, and the other thing maybe to finish with is, right now, therapeutic plasma exchange is quite expensive. So, depending on the clinic you go to, it could be anywhere from $4,000 to $12,000, maybe even $20,000 at some clinics per session. Whereas plasma donation typically is going to be free. So there is that economic piece where, if therapeutic plasma exchange isn't right for you, or you can't afford it, or you don't want to spend that much money, which I totally get. I was lucky that I got mine for free, so I didn't spend that much money. Then maybe plasma donation, if you're in a location where you can do plasma donation, is a way to go, where you can get at least some of the potential benefits that might accrue from therapeutic plasma exchange. So that's the last thing I'll say. It makes perfect sense to me why therapeutic plasma exchange would have benefits, but we don't completely know what those benefits are. So I think it's important to always just state this is still sort of an experimental therapy. I think the risks are very, very low, and the rationale for benefits is pretty good, but we really don't know yet how large the benefits are going to be for most people.
All right. Well, I hate to keep on hyping up future episodes, but you're in the middle of an N of 1 experiment. Yeah. And assuming at the end of that, you're going to have a full episode on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, today, right after we get done, I've got a blood draw, which is sort of my post-TPE blood draw, to look and see whether any biomarkers have moved substantially. That's partly why I'm probably not speaking as clearly as I typically would, because I haven't eaten yet this morning, and I do not do well with morning fasts, but we're muddling through.
Yeah. All right. All right. Next question. What's your take on hyperbaric oxygen therapy as a longevity tool? So there's a 2020 Israel study, as well as Brian Johnson recently did an experiment.
Yeah. So I think I have to, first of all, just make the disclaimer that I haven't done a deep dive on hyperbaric oxygen therapy, like the overall data, to really try to come to, some sort of strongly held opinion. So I've got opinions. They are weakly held because I recognize this is an area where I'm not as informed as I'd like to be before I really comment, vigorously about a topic. So a couple of things I would say. I haven't seen Brian Johnson's experiment. I haven't watched the video. I assume there's a video. I haven't watched the video. I saw, I think, a headline that he claimed that after hyperbaric oxygen therapy, his biological age went to that of a 10-year-old. So clearly that's just stupid. I'm sorry, it's stupid. Anybody could look at the guy and tell he is not biologically a 10-year-old. Assuming he actually said that, it was a headline. So maybe I'm picking on Brian Johnson for something that he didn't actually say, but I'm guessing he probably said.
His rate of aging is that of a 10-year-old. Probably, that's how he usually phrases it. But.
So in any case, that's just dumb. It's not true. I'm guessing that's based on an epigenetic test. We've had lots of episodes about why you should not use epigenetic tests. I'll just say personally, I don't trust anything that Brian Johnson says anymore. I think we've learned that he is not transparent, even though he uses that word thousands of times. He doesn't share all of his data. So I am somebody who believes that when a person shows that they are dishonest once, they will be dishonest again. And so I just, don't think I can trust anything that he says. So I wouldn't draw any conclusions from his experiment. Let's just say hypothetically that one episode of hyperbaric oxygen therapy did in fact, or does in fact, change the epigenetic profile associated with pace of aging or biological age by that much. That's super interesting. My intuition is if that was the case, we would know it already. So there is, a little bit of evidence that hyperbaric oxygen therapy can move epigenetic aging clocks, but nowhere near that much. So I think we don't know what that means. So does that mean that there are impacts on immune function primarily, or isn't it in fact that HBOT is transiently affecting these biological age measures or permanently affecting them? We don't know. We just need more data. And that's partly why I don't have super strong opinions, because I don't feel like the quality or quantity of data with HBOT is very compelling at this point. It's intriguing, I would say. I think the other things I would add is I'm not aware of any data yet that hyperbaric oxygen therapy slows aging or increases lifespan in laboratory animals. That's kind of the first step to call something a longevity therapy. It's possible that data is out there. I'm not aware of it. I'm not aware of any data yet that hyperbaric oxygen therapy certainly increases lifespan in people. No evidence for that. Or broadly improves health metrics. I mean, there are some small studies that are suggestive of some health benefits for certain types of conditions in people. But again, much like I think the totality of data on this topic, even there, the data is pretty sparse, not very compelling. So I think we need more. I do think this is an interesting example where you can compare it to something like therapeutic plasma exchange. And you can ask, given the data that we have, given the rationale, how do we sort of think about those things, right? Because both of them are experimental. We don't know, right? In my mind, the case for therapeutic plasma exchange is better because the rationale for how it is working biologically makes more sense to me, that it would actually have benefits in terms of aging and, more broadly speaking, health, particularly in the context of environmental exposures like microplastics and pollutants and heavy metals and toxins. It makes sense to me that diluting those out through something like therapeutic plasma exchange is going to have beneficial effects. And the parabiosis data in animals is quite compelling. So to me, therapeutic plasma exchange, I put in the bucket of, that's probably going to work. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and again, this might reflect my, limited depth of knowledge in this topic, but at the level that I understand how it's supposedly working, it's just less compelling. I get the idea that boosting oxygen availability, broadly speaking, to tissues and the brain in particular, could have benefits. It could also do some bad stuff. Like we know reactive oxygen species are one of the things that cause a lot of molecular damage. And so to me, the rationale just isn't quite as strong for something like hyperbaric oxygen therapy.
So two quick thoughts. The first one on Brian Johnson is Joseph, who's recently in the office.
Yeah.
He has a popular channel called What I've Learned. And he's got an amazing YouTube short series, 30 episodes that are all about that I point people towards. I think it's something else coming out that you were a part of. So
yeah, we did an interview. It wasn't about Brian Johnson, but more broadly speaking, about a bunch of longevity topics. Yeah, I mean, I think again, everybody's free to draw their own conclusions about who they're going to listen to and why they're going to pay attention to those people. I do think some of the information that Joseph has put out, as well as lots of other people, to my view, paints a pretty dark picture there. And again, that's partly why I'm just like, I disengage. I'm not gonna take anything from information that guy puts out.
The other thought on the hyperbaric oxygen therapy, I kind of guess borrowed from Peter Attia, but his sort of mentality is like, again, he's very bullish on exercise, and my background bullish on exercise as well. And just the opportunity cost. It takes 90 minutes to drive there, to do it, to drive back. Could you be doing a different longevity or health intervention and gotten a better ROI during that time?
Yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing about therapeutic plasma exchange. It's a time-consuming process too. So, but I get that. I get that critique, right? It takes what it takes. So it really, in my view, comes more down to does the risk does the reward outweigh the risk for these different things that you're considering? I guess under risk or cost, that's the other piece, is cost. There's financial cost, but then there's time cost as well. That should all go into the equation. Absolutely, there are other things you can do where we know they're going to have benefits. Again, just think about the pillars of health. So when you think about hyperbaric oxygen therapy, red light therapy, TPE, all this stuff that's a big maybe, I think you have to factor in potential reward, potential risk, cost, both financial and time, when you make the decision whether you're going to do these things or not.
All right, great. So next question. Thoughts on the latest discoveries like Astaxanthin and C15?
Right. So, okay, so let's take those two separately. So first of all, I'll just say I don't take either of them. I think for longevity, the case for astaxanthin is much better than for C15. So C15 is sold under the sort of marketing name Fatty 15, but they're the same thing. So astaxanthin, this is a pigment that is found in algae, salmon, shrimp, so some different types of sea life. It is typically talked about as a very potent antioxidant. So what's the case for longevity? So it increases lifespan in worms, and I think more convincingly, it's one of the molecules that the interventions testing program has found increases lifespan in mice. Now the lifespan effect, I think, was about 10%, so not as good as rapamycin or acarbose. And unlike rapamycin, similar to acarbose, it was a male-specific lifespan extension. So again, if you're, and this is where I think it's hard, right? Because if you're going to say, okay, I'm going to take it because it works in mice, then you kind of have to say, then if you're a woman, it didn't work in mice. So I don't think we know what that sex-specific effect means, but it's not uncommon for the studies in mice. So that's kind of what we know. The human studies are pretty limited, but again, there are some small studies that have been showing interesting potential health benefits for certain types of conditions. So I think, it's probably not overtly harmful. We never really know what the long-term effects are going to be. Antioxidant is a very general term, and when supplements are like that's the best descriptor we have for a supplement. Oh, it's a really good antioxidant. I get kind of worried because that really just means we don't know how it's working. So I mean, I don't know. I would put it kind of in the second tier of supplements where there's pretty good reason to think there could be some benefits there, but we don't really know at this point.
Okay, and I'm guessing if you had to take one, it would be astaxanthin.
Out of those two, I think right now the evidence is better for astaxanthin. It's a different type of molecule, right? So fatty 15 or C15-0 is pentadecanoic acid. So it's a fatty acid, naturally occurring in our bodies. So in this case, it's a different situation than astaxanthin because we're not putting something in that we don't already have in our bodies. So when you think again about risk reward, how does that sort of weigh in? You would intuitively think that if it's something that's naturally already in our bodies, the risk is going to be lower. Of course, certainly you can push things out of homeostasis by taking too much of a molecule that's already in our bodies anyway. So to me right now, and again, I haven't done a super deep dive on fatty 15. I've looked at the original papers. So maybe I'm missing something. I'll say that about astaxanthin too. Like I haven't spent hours really digging into either of these. But to me right now, it feels like with fatty 15, this is much more hype than substance at this point. I think, unfortunately, I think in this space, we have seen multiple examples recently of academics who make an interesting discovery, and instead of then doing the hard experiments to get more data and actually show efficacy, if it's a compound where they can go right to market, they just start a company and start selling this stuff to people. I feel kind of like that's what happened here. And again, this is a bigger issue with the direct-to-consumer supplement industry and its corrupting influence and all of that stuff. But so my understanding is the connection to longevity really came exclusively from cell culture studies. So these are, you take cells, you grow them in a dish. In this case, you look for molecular markers, gene expression markers, things like that, and ask what are some molecules that look like known longevity factors like rapamycin based on those markers. I think that's how this came out. And then, if I remember correctly, they claim that they looked at measures of different hallmarks of aging, and this one performed the best. Okay, it is what it is. All in cells, though. So again, I'm not aware of any lifespan data in mice showing that fatty 15 has any benefits on longevity. It is currently under testing by the ITP. I think we're still pretty early. I think it was maybe 2023 or 2024 this was selected. So it's going to be a little while before we know the answer. I think when that answer comes out, I'll be able to have a little bit more confidence one way or the other whether this is really a longevity molecule. Right now, the human data is correlative. There is some correlative data that higher levels of fatty 15 are associated with better health outcomes. It's correlation, not causation. Does it mean anything? Hard to say. To me, it's a pretty weak case for some of the claims that are being made about this molecule by the people selling it.
How can you be deficient in vitamin D? Do you have daylight where you are?
Okay, I'm excited. I'm going to hope that's a joke, but maybe not. So in case it's not, I mean, again, I get this is probably like a little bit snark and a little bit serious like that. So a couple things just to appreciate. There is absolutely a very clear and strong correlation between the latitude where you live and vitamin D synthesis. And this is because at northern or southern latitudes, there are strong differences in the amount of UV exposure that we experience. And of course, light exposure is what promotes vitamin D synthesis. So it actually is non-trivial, the effect that where you live has on your body's natural likelihood to make vitamin D. And then, of course, in our current, environments that we live in, many people live in developed countries, we don't spend as much time outdoors. So again, we're not synthesizing as much vitamin D. And in fact, I mean, it's actually pretty interesting. There are also, independent of where you live, there are also seasonal effects that are pretty profound. Again, because you aren't exposed, even if you're outside, you're not exposed to as much sunlight in the winter months as in the summer months. So I think those two things combined simply make it a fact that many, maybe a majority of people in the United States are low or deficient, and exactly where that line is between low and deficient, I think even in the medicine 2.0 world is still a little bit unclear. But I think almost everybody would agree that many people are low in vitamin D. And so then the hypothesis is if you supplement vitamin D and bring it back into the optimal or normal range, that's going to be better than being low or deficient. So it makes sense to supplement those cases.
Something I've always wondered is you have two people and they both have a vitamin D level at 80, and one got it through supplements and staying indoors, and one got it through outside. Is there any real difference in the outcome?
I think we don't know. I think it is, again, intuitive to believe that getting it naturally is better than supplementing. But I think we really don't know the answer to that. And again, there's there's a lack of clarity about what is the right vitamin D level to shoot for, what's optimal. Like, I don't think anybody really knows. And again, this is where, I mean, it's just, unfortunately, I think some of these influencers feel like they have to speak with certainty about things where they just simply don't know, and it misleads people. The reality is we don't know about vitamin D. We don't know that supplementing actually leads to major health benefits, but I think it is obvious that if you are low or deficient, you should supplement, in my view. It's interesting on both ends. So I recently saw, I think this was on Instagram, Instagram post from a very, very popular social media influencer, kind of a scientist, kind of not, talking about, a study of vitamin D where telomeres were lengthened. And I'm like, come on, first of all, and making the case that it's an anti-aging drug. First of all, that's a crappy biomarker for aging biology. Everybody in the field knows that. And secondly, it's a really weak study. So overhyping that, I think, is not helpful. And then I was at the Live Long conference. This was several months ago now. And the guy who runs a supplement testing organization was saying nobody should supplement vitamin D. He said this during his talk, and I actually, raised my hand and said, well, okay, that's actually not the consensus opinion in the medical community right now. Push back on that. So you get people on both sides, unfortunately. Here's what I think. I think if you're below 30, you should supplement. I personally shoot for 50 to 60. Some people, and I've said, I think probably even here, I've come down a little bit. I think before I was like, you want to be between 60 and 90. I don't know the answer, right? I don't know. I probably think there's really not a lot of difference between 50 and 60 or 60 to 80, maybe even up to 90. Probably don't want to go above 90. We know once you get over 100, that is associated with problems. So that's kind of the way I think about vitamin D. I've said this lots of times. You definitely want to measure. I get frustrated by, again, influencers or physicians who just recommend everybody take a supplement without actually looking to see, this is a biomarker you can measure, so you should, looking to see where you're at. So you should measure and then supplement as needed once you know what your vitamin D levels are. It takes a while. So this isn't one of those supplements where when you take it, you're immediately going to see it change the next day in your blood work. So it takes a while to get to equilibrium. So you want to be careful not to overshoot. I've done that. I've gotten over 100 and had to back off. So take it slow and recognize that season, especially if you're somebody who gets outdoors, is going to impact your natural synthesis, and you can try to modify your supplementation based on that.
All right, great. So can you make a video about how microplastics affect health and what we can do about it?
I could, maybe I should. I definitely need to do a deeper dive on this topic. Part of the reason why I'm hesitant to really do a lot on this topic is I feel like there's a lot of people out there talking about it, and I don't know yet that it's really a longevity issue. It could be, for sure. So I think my impression is right now, we just don't know how bad this is, right? We don't know if it is like a minor thing that only a small fraction of the population is actually going to run into any problems from, or this is something, that's going to cause the entire human race to go sterile and stop reproducing. I mean, obviously that's an extreme situation, but I think we just don't know. So there's a lot of fear, certainly, out there. And I think that is leading to a bias in the research community to find connections between microplastics and any bad thing you can think of that's possibly out there. And again, I'm not at all saying there isn't a connection, but I think this is causing people to go looking for things and find things that may be pretty minor right now. So I think it's going to take a couple of years at least for us to really have a good feel for, how bad is it? It could be really bad. Don't get me wrong. And again, it could also be that it's really not a big deal for most people. The reality is likely somewhere in the middle. So I think for now, the steps you can take, it's absolutely prudent to reduce your exposure. So stop drinking out of plastic bottles to the extent that you can, right? Try not to eat foods that are stored in plastic containers, right? Those kinds of things are obvious to me to try to do, but do it from the position of, prudent steps to take as opposed to doing it from a position of fear is kind of the way I think about it. And I think we've talked a couple times about therapeutic plasma exchange in this episode already. Things like therapeutic plasma exchange might be approaches to reduce your burden of microplastics in circulation and in tissues going forward. So I'm, enthusiastic about the possibility that approaches will be developed in addition to dilution that can help to deal with the consequences of microplastic exposure, whatever those are going to end up being.
Hopefully we can learn more about that soon. So next question. Do you think a gene therapy to correct APOB4 is realistic?
Probably not in the near future. There's a couple of reasons that it's difficult to envision an effective gene therapy for APOE4. So again, probably most people listening already know this, but APOE4, apolipoprotein E4, is a specific variant of apolipoprotein E. There are three: E2, E3, and E4. E2 is the one that's typically considered to be a predictor of reduced cardiovascular disease risk and reduced risk of dementia. E3 is the most common variant. E4 is the predictor of higher cardiovascular disease risk and higher risk of dementia. People can be carriers of E4, meaning they have one copy of E4 and one copy that is one of the other alleles, or they can be homozygous for E4. So if you are a carrier or homozygous for E4, meaning you have two copies of E4, you're at higher risk of those conditions. And so the question is, could we have a gene therapy that would fix it? Make you an E3 or maybe even make you an E2, give you two copies of the really, really good allele, what we think is the really good allele right now. So why is that hard? One is you would probably need to do it in utero, so very, very early in development. There are technical challenges and ethical challenges with doing that. And then two, if you were to try to do it post-developmentally in adults, I don't know that you could target enough cells or enough of the right cells to actually have the effects. And in particular, astrocytes and microglia are going to be hard to target with a gene therapy. So I think we're probably a ways away from a gene therapy approach. The good news is that you can offset most of the risks associated with the E4 variant through lifestyle changes and some newer therapies that I think will probably do even better. So even though I don't think we're going to have a gene therapy anytime soon, I think there are approaches you can do now and things that are coming down the pipeline that will help offset the risks that people who have the E4 allele experience.
Yeah, great. I mean, I think I played E4, so E4, E3, so I have one above.
Yeah.
And you compare the hazard ratio to that versus having low cardiovascular fitness or the other thing that you could control. And actually, it's a little bit empowering. I'm going to focus on what I can control.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I think the data is pretty clear. You can pretty much or completely offset the higher risks if you really dial in your pillars of health, lifestyle factors.
Absolutely. All right, next question. Have you seen lifespan differences in dogs eating cold foods versus dogs who eat kibble?
Okay, so this is referring to the Dog Aging Project. And dietary intake is one of the things that we capture in the Dog Aging Project through our primary survey instrument. So all of the data we've got comes from owner-reported information on diet. And we've done an analysis of kibble, raw diet, cooked diet, and published a paper. Actually, I think it just came out in Journal of Veterinary Internal Medicine on this. So in that study, this was, again, observational. So correlation does not equal causation, and owner reported. There were almost 30,000 dogs in the study. And again, compared homemade cooked, commercial raw, homemade raw, or extruded, which is kibble. That's, I guess, the technical term. So surprisingly, no big effects were observed, right? And what I mean by big, so, we did a different study, which we published a couple of years ago, where we looked at feeding frequency. So dogs fed once a day versus dogs fed more than once a day. And we found pretty significant reductions in risk of diagnosis with different age-related diseases from feeding frequency, dogs fed once a day. These effects were nowhere near that big. So I would say it's not a huge difference, but there were some differences. So the home-cooked diets had higher risk of GI, liver, and kidney disease. The commercial raw diets, they're not kibble, but this is something you would buy, commercially had higher risk of respiratory disease. And again, just to be completely clear, this is observational, and these are risks of having been diagnosed with that condition. This is owners reporting that the dog has had a diagnosis of that condition and what they're eating right now. So that's important because that affects how you interpret this. Certainly could be reverse causation, meaning the dog was diagnosed with the condition first, and that's why the owner put them on a home-cooked diet or a commercial raw diet. And I think we have to recognize these are pretty big categories. So a home-cooked diet could mean a lot of different things depending on the household you're in. And so there may be consequences of that influence the risk of certain conditions because owners are all obviously very different people. So I would say based on this, there's no signal that kibble is better or worse from a health perspective for dogs. I know that's going to upset a lot of people who very, very strongly believe that raw food is the only way to go or whatever. That's just what the data is. And I will say, Dog Aging Project, it's no funding from the dog food companies, no connection to the dog food industry. I'm sorry if you don't like the answer. That's the answer right now.
All right. So I feel like related to this whole episode so far, why do scientists struggle to give straight answers? Most of the
Are you saying that I am giving long-winded answers? So,
no.
I mean, first of all, I'd say there's a couple of ways to interpret that question. But I think, it is true. Like for some of these questions, I could have probably given a one-sentence answer, and that would have been good enough for a lot of people. But I'm trained to try to be accurate and precise in what I say, and still people misinterpret a lot of what I say, even though all the details and disclaimers are there. So I think it's partly a training thing, right? That scientists are trained to be cautious and to try to be accurate. And the reality is, look, some things are complicated. They don't have easy answers. Again, I'm sorry if you don't like that. That's just life. That's the reality. Biology is complicated, and so it's hard sometimes to give simple answers. So that's kind of one interpretation for why scientists struggle to give straight answers. Another could be, and again, I don't know what the context is that this person's asking, right? Another could be, why do scientists not call out BS, right? Typically, right? And especially in the longevity field, most scientists sit quiet even when they hear stuff that they know is not true. And I don't know the answer. I mean, I kind of do know some of the answers to that. It's certainly been my impression. And obviously I am more on the edge of, calling out the BS than most of my colleagues, although even still, I keep my mouth shut a lot of the times. And I think partly it's a culture in science that science has gotten softer in the last 50 years. Now, obviously I wasn't doing science 50 years ago, so I'm basing it on kind of what I perceive was the culture back then. But I mean, I feel like science used to be much more about challenging your colleagues, not out of meanness, but out of trying to get closer to the right answer and trying to disprove hypotheses. I think many scientists these days are not trained to disprove hypotheses. They're trained to try to prove their models. So that's part of it. I feel like just the culture of science is soft today. And instead, at least in public, what happens in science is most of the criticism, most of the questioning, it happens behind the anonymity of peer review or grant review. Again, maybe that's better. I don't think so. Maybe that's better, but that's the reality is in public, scientists are very hesitant to question their colleagues. In private, they just go extreme the other direction and tear people apart. It's really dysfunctional. I would also say in this field, unfortunately, there's a lot of ends justify the means thinking. Absolutely. I have been in events with colleagues where I see them, saying and doing things that they disclaim in other situations because they're around rich people and they're hoping to get money from this people, or because they're hoping that, these people can get them, some sort of connection that they'll find valuable. Maybe that's the right way to, in my view, it's not the right way to do it. Maybe that's an effective way to be successful. But I think that's part of the reason why you see very few scientists calling out, especially people who are high profile, who have big followings, who are rich, even when they're doing things that are, clearly not scientific. Wow. So that was a long-winded answer to why scientists struggle to give straight answers.
Yeah.
But that was pretty straight.
True. I think it's more the lens of C15 is it good or bad? It's less like how much you talk. It's more about they just want it.
Well, I mean, that's because people don't like the answer, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is the truth, which is why I think it's important to kind of give context, and that context then informs a probabilistic answer, right?
Exactly.
So I guess I could say my probabilistic answer is there is a 15% chance that fatty 15 is going to increase longevity. And if it does, it will increase longevity by 2 months. Like, obviously that's not my actual answer, but it's pretty close. Actually, if you force me right today to say, what do you think that the chances are and the magnitude of effect would be, that's what I would say. 15% chance to get a tiny effect on longevity for the average person. Of course, it's going to be very individual. Now I'm getting back into scientist speak, but that's not for everyone. That's for across the population. And that's complicated.
The hard part with the podcast and the internet is, let's say you did that route, put it out, a year later, that percent's going to change. So you're going to have to constantly update, that probability of C15 and others.
Yeah. And I mean, again, this is maybe why there aren't very many scientists that have, millions of followers, right? Is because you see people who will give that answer and they'll say something that, first of all, isn't science-based, but it's a very simple answer. You should do X. You should eat only, raw deer meat. That's the diet. That's all you should eat and you will live 10 years longer, right? I mean, obviously don't do that. That's stupid. But you hear people who say stuff like that, right? And it's not scientific. It's actually probably dangerous, but it's simple. And so you get clicks and people who want an easy answer will tune in. And so when you give a much more nuanced, thoughtful answer, I think it's much harder to get a lot of people to pay attention. Having said that, the people who do pay attention are going to be much better informed and actually probably much more likely to get the outcomes that they're after. So, it is what it is.
Yeah, and I heard someone say, I forget who, but I'm not just saying this because it'd be good for this channel, but it just seems like the pendulum is starting to swing where people are being frustrated with the influencers who are like, here's how it is, and people are actually finding the scientific conversations more refreshing. So
yeah, we'll see.
Hopefully it does.
I mean, again, look, would I like it if we had 10 million followers or got 10 million views for all of our videos? Yeah, I think that would be good, but it's not because I'm trying to become the most popular internet influencer out there. I mean, people can, again, you can believe it or not, but I'm doing this because, first of all, I like talking about this stuff. And secondly, I want to help people. Right. And so, if we could reach more people, that's great, but I'm not going to dilute out the quality of the content just to get more clicks. And so, look, I'm happy with people who are listening. First of all, I love all the comments that people send in. I've met a lot of really cool people doing this. And so, we're just going to keep doing it. And, if more people turn away from the pseudoscience and the nonsense and start to pay attention, great. If not, then you guys, good for you. That's it. Thanks for watching the OptiSpan podcast. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. Again, you can check out the OptiSpan podcast website and leave your questions there, and we will try to get them on a future episode of Ask Matt Anything. Thanks to my little friend here for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time on the podcast.